He's had a varied and impressive career as a lawyer and as an academic. And even more wide-ranging and impressive have been his writings, which range across the history of ideas, an assessment of the future of this country, history of religion, medieval philosophy, and ancient philosophy. And you will get a full appreciation and assessment of his achievements this evening at 8 o'clock when Professor Rubenstein will talk in the University Theater about religion and violence in the 21st century. His topic this afternoon is why Americans fight our national religion as a cause of war. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rubenstein.
Professor Borgman, thank you for that introduction. And hello, everybody. I'm glad to be here. And I am taking the liberty this afternoon. I think I'm inspired by being in Montana for the first time and breathing the liberating air of the West. I had decided rather than give the usual sort of seminar lecture, which is based on some book I've already written or an article that's been entirely worked out, I would, in a way, go back to the original tradition of the seminar, which is to present some work in progress with the initial apologia that's exactly what it is, a work in progress. Recently begun, so that I will be talking about things that I have been thinking about and reading about for a while, but not for that long, and matters in which I hope to get some help from you all in formulating my ideas. This comes from a new book project which I've started to work on now, tentatively entitled Reasons to Kill, Why Americans Go to War. The project was inspired, I suppose, really by the Iraq War, by the two Iraq wars, and by a feeling that I had in both cases, and we'll be able to talk about this a little bit more later, that in some ways I was looking at a new phenomenon, and in some ways something much older in American history. That is to say, the entrapment, if you want to put it that way, and I do, of Americans in wars of dubious morality and usefulness, which they nevertheless enthusiastically embraced after a period of being quite skeptical about both. The question, in other words, that I asked myself was not why does the nation go to war, which is a code word for, the nation is a code word for elites within the nation who have their own reasons for going to war, but why do ordinary American citizens, and in a more general way, why do ordinary citizens anywhere, agree to participate in wars, despite the fact that in many cases in the past, the inducements to go to war have been deceptive. The wars themselves have been much more costly and painful than they had been told that they would be, and the results are, to say the least, ambiguous, if not obviously destructive. I'm not in this study taking a pacifist position. I think it's possible that there are good wars. But I am taking a position which asks a question which, strangely enough, is not asked very much. When people talk about causes of war, that usually produces the kind of standard historical analysis of why elites go to war. And then the question of why masses of people follow them is reduced to an issue of propaganda. For example, if we're studying the Spanish-American War, we immediately learn that that was the age of the yellow press, and the combination of government propaganda and press releases about the situation in Cuba generated a momentum, generated a sentiment on the part of the American people to go to liberate the Cubans and give the Spanish a black eye. This normal analysis, I'm going to put it this way, of the motivations for war does two things. It objectifies the causes. That is to say, one often ends up talking about U.S. national security being threatened, or settlers wanting new land, or free workers being forced to compete with slave labor, etc. Secondly, as I just said, it focuses more on elite motivation than on why the masses would follow. And the result of this is that there are really two implicit theories in the way this question is often handled. Well, the punchline of this first paragraph, anyway, is that when I came to think about writing a book on why ordinary Americans, people like you and me, go to war, I found that there was no book that dealt with that. And Walter Millis had written something a while back on the martial spirit. There have been kind of stabs at it made here and there, but no serious systematic treatment, and nothing recent. The two implicit theories, I think, that are correlated with this, what I'm calling the standard approach to the question, we could call the frontier killer thesis and the innocent dupe thesis. Let me say a quick word about each. Frontier killers. The frontier killer notion is based on an approach to culture that stresses the persistence of primitive atavistic drives in people, and very often links the martial spirit among Americans to the early history of the Republic, especially to the frontier experience, the Indian fighting experience, and so on. This theory, which most academics will immediately raise their eyebrows at for all sorts of reasons, is particularly current among Europeans who observe America with a shudder and talk about gun-toting, violence-loving, super macho people who like to fight. And think about that, whether they admit it or not, as a part of our national character. We're fighters. So that we're thrown back in this kind of analysis to the days of the frontier, to Indian fighting, the Code Duello, and so on. By contrast, and a very stark contrast, the theory that one hears a great deal of locally, as well as sometimes in Europe and elsewhere outside the country, is what I call the innocent dupe thesis. This is the idea that American innocents are tabula rasas waiting to be written on by manipulative leaders and news media, so that they are misled into fighting, misled into believing that their own interests are at stake when in fact only elite interests or somebody else's interests are at stake, are willing, for reasons that are never very adequately explained, to accept what the authorities say about the national interest, about immediate dangers, and so forth, and to go to war, in fact, on command. a thesis that most people who have any feeling at all for the American character and about what we're like will reject, or at least look at a bit askance, since we are also a people profoundly ambivalent about authority, very skeptical from time to time about authority, unwilling to be convinced without an argument. And the innocent dupe theory, shall I say, as well as the frontier killer theory, are both given the lie to some extent by the actual experience of our people during the periods of run-up to war. Because when wars are first proposed to us, we are almost always opposed to them. Perhaps one exception is the Spanish-American War, which I'll talk about in a moment. But in almost every other case, so powerful, really, are the oppositional currents to getting involved in war. Well, the first person to notice this was de Tocqueville. And I don't have the quote in front of me, but de Tocqueville says in Democracy in America, written in 1836, de Tocqueville says, Americans, I'm paraphrasing, Americans are much too interested in their own private affairs and their businesses to want to march off to war the way more martial cultures sometimes do. De Tocqueville is also thinking of the fact that there's no native aristocracy with a militaristic background here, and that for a long time in America, before the age of the volunteer, the so-called volunteer army, volunteer if you can, assuming that you have another job to go to. But at any rate, before that age, all wars were fought by either militias or draftees or both. And de Tocqueville said Americans don't like war very much, not necessarily for any great noble reasons, but because of their interest in their private affairs and business. Whether for that reason or for other reasons, the resistance to wars when they are first proposed has been very strong. And therefore, it's been necessary to overcome that resistance by resort to what some people call propaganda, and I would rather call argumentation, arguments and images often emanating from the government or from the supporters of the war, which prove over time to be influential with Americans. So the question I ask myself is, what are those arguments? What are those images? Which are the particularly potent appeals which get us into a war-fighting mood, or at least the mood of paying the costs of the war, supporting the war, sending our children in harm's way, and so on. Incidentally, I had been consulting when I first decided to write a book like this, maybe. I got hold of a bunch of new books written mainly in the wake of the Iraq War by writers, very good writers like Andrew Bacevich and others, which talk about the new militarism and about America having entered a stage in which basically we have a mercenary force which will fight on command, etc. It seemed to me that rather than solving the problems that I had just posed, these books were kind of compounding them. They were actually putting together the two theories. We had been consistently duped, according to them. The consistent duping plus economic necessity creates this large cadre of mercenaries who will then fight. It does not really answer the question how public opposition to war gets overcome. Doesn't answer the question of which arguments are most persuasive with us and why. And it kind of combines the fighting culture with the dupe theory in a way that I don't feel personally is very satisfying. So what can we say about these? First of all, let me immediately say that I think that there's truth to both of the theories. That is to say, the founding myths of our nation do glorify aggressive behavior, although Cowboys and Indians is out of style. Certainly for people my age, we grew up on Westerns. Aggressive behavior glorified so long as it's directed towards people who are considered qualitatively unlike us, threatening to us, and inferior to us in their level of civilization. Tom Engelhardt makes brilliant use of these Indian fighting images in his book, which is called The End of Victory Culture. He's a former journalist who's writing really some wonderful stuff on this subject. His analysis throws a lurid glow, among other things, on the concept of self-defense in America. Since the core of the settlers versus Indian myths is that the settlers are always practicing self-defense. They are never invaders, they're settlers. They are coming to make a reasonable use of land which is empty or being misused. And when you talk about casus belli, talk about the reasons people fight, the reasons for war, the image that always comes to mind is the settlers circling the wagons, is the settlers in a obviously defensive mode, being surrounded by a kind of unearthly enemy, the other with a capital O, two capital O's, people who have taken white women captive, who have committed atrocities, who love torture, etc. And people who outnumber us, the settlers, by large numbers, so that the use of whatever technological superiority we have against them is always justified. When you're outnumbered by hordes of savages, you know, circling you on their horses, and the only thing you can do is gun them down with an Enfield rifle, or for that matter, a machine gun, or one wants to say almost an atomic weapon, so be it. Because the posture is considered initially defensive. I want to come back to the idea of self-defense and evil enemies in a minute, since I think that's an important part of a theme that relates to what I call national religion. At the same time, you know, this sort of narrative shows, what Engelhardt doesn't talk about this kind of narrative shows the need for justification. A need for justification. One of the, what people don't say in cowboys and Indians stories, films, etc., they don't say we needed the territory. You know, they don't say the cotton crop was burned out in the Old South, so we needed Texas. They don't say it served our material interests to have this fight. They don't say it served our geopolitical interests to have this fight. Intellectuals can talk about manifest destiny and so forth all they like, and talk about geopolitical interests then and yesterday, today, and tomorrow. But when you're addressing the American people and trying to get them up for war, you don't talk like that. All right? You talk about moral necessity. So even the Indian narratives contain within them elements of a moral justification, always. All right, well, if there's some truth to the frontier killer thesis, there's even more truth to the innocent dupe thesis. And without rehearsing all this with you, the time is limited, the history of deception and provocation in bringing about America's wars is mind-boggling. For the life of me, you know, the only people who have written about it are libertarians. I've discovered, looking at the literature, the followers of Hayek, von Hayek in particular, people who don't like the big state, even when it does good things, especially don't like the big state when it goes to war. And so we have some really excoriating articles by right-wingers, very interesting stuff, about the origins of a number of American wars. And so whether we talk about the War of 1812, which was presented to me, I don't know if you remember your early American history education, but always presented to me the War of 1812 as a war provoked by British impressment of American seamen during the Napoleonic Wars. And it took one of these libertarians to point out to me that the seamen that the British were impressing were mostly people who had escaped from British ships. They were American sailors who had enlisted in the British Navy, as well as British sailors, and who, in the midst of this life and death struggle for England against Napoleon, had escaped, had deserted, and were now sailing on American ships. So the British, although they also did impress some innocent Americans, the British were actually looking for fugitives. Nobody ever told me that in grade school when I studied the War of 1812. Nor did they talk about territorial ambitions for Canada, etc. But things really get kind of shocking if you are easily shocked when you talk about the Mexican-American War. When you talk about President Polk announcing to Congress, American blood has been shed on American soil. This war exists by the act of Mexico alone, despite all our efforts to settle it peacefully. That's a direct quote, maybe with a few of the words transposed. When in fact we now know that President Polk, who wanted a war with Mexico for all kinds of reasons, the most important of which being California, sent troops into disputed territory knowing that that would provoke a response from the Mexicans. It had to provoke a response from the Mexicans, and that would justify his war. And further, that it was not just a war to increase American territory, it was a war to increase American slave territory. The acquisition of Texas was done with that in mind, and the Mexican War was done with that in mind. To the extent even that John Quincy Adams said, if Polk had lost the election of 1844 and Henry Clay had been elected, there would have been no Civil War. The irrepressible conflict might not have turned out to be irrepressible if the consensus that had been developed about the use of the territories had not been blown up by the Mexican War. Well, I don't know about that, but of course we do know what the outcome of the Mexican War was. And here I just want to underline the kind of strange disparity, the strange disjunction in our thinking between material and geopolitical ambitions, territorial ambitions, which in this case very clearly included the whole American West all the way to California, from Colorado to California. Even before the war started, Washington ordered the Navy in the Pacific to get ready to seize California. In the same way, by the way, when the Spanish-American War started, Teddy Roosevelt, who was then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, ordered Commodore Dewey in the Philippines to prepare to attack the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay, and this was weeks before war was declared against Spain. Well, I say I'm not easily shocked. I mean, I know nations do things like this, and that America is not uniquely violent or greedy when it comes to grabbing territory. But what is interesting and strange is that since leaders don't feel it politic or possible to talk to American people about these things, they become repressed, and I mean that actually in psychological terms. They become a kind of repressed content of the content of these wars, such that when the war breaks out, Americans are convinced to fight in it by arguments which are mainly moral. For example, liberating the oppressed Cuban people in Cuba, who were terribly oppressed by the Spanish in Cuba. And the repressed material, as repressed material will do, returns eventually. The return of the repressed takes place usually after the war. When the war is over and it becomes apparent that the great moral ambitions that were expressed in the fight are not usually obtained, then we have a sudden rush to consciousness of what some of the other motives for the war were. This took place actually, in the case of the Mexican War, it took place early because the Whig Party, especially with John Quincy Adams' moral leadership, and Abraham Lincoln also, when the Mexican War broke out, Congressman Lincoln said, and Polk said, American blood has been shed on American soil. Congressman Lincoln said, show us the spot. Show us where the blood was spilled. But after the war is over, then the recriminations begin. And very often that's when we get hearings like the Nye Commission hearings after World War I, which talked about the interests of the armaments manufacturers, the well, they didn't call it the military-industrial complex then, but that's what they were talking about in fomenting World War I, which was an unnecessary war in the opinion of many people, including me. So, if you go to World War I, and you want to talk also about Vietnam, and you want to talk also about the two Iraq wars, again and again you find, it seems to me, the same theme. That is to say, there is a deceptive invitation to go to war. In the case of World War I, as you know, Woodrow Wilson campaigned on a peace platform in 1916. He would keep the country out of war. Nobody wanted to go to war in 1916, despite the Lusitania, etc. It took about a year to turn the country around on World War I. And one of the main elements brought into play that turned the country around on World War I was a transformation of the image of the German. Remember, there were many German Americans. A transformation of the image of the Kaiser, who had formerly been portrayed as a kind of bumbling old man with kind of laughable imperial ambitions, Kaiser Bill, who now became a kind of demonic, an evil leader. And the German army itself, which on its march through Belgium was portrayed as engaging in the most disgusting atrocities, a drumbeat of atrocity stories coming out about the Germans, who I'm sure were guilty of some atrocities, as armies are in war. But suddenly they became this satanic image was attached to the Germans. I'm going to come back to what made it possible to mobilize Americans for World War I in such a short time when they had not been mobilized before, also with a confession to say, I'm not really sure. I have a few kind of speculative ideas about it. But the point that I'm getting to, kind of staggering to here, is that if one wants to talk about the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the fake attack, North Vietnamese attack on American boats in the Gulf of Tonkin, or if one wants to talk about Saddam Hussein invading Kuwait, and then the United States being told by everybody from King Abdullah of Jordan to Primakov of the Soviet Union to the Prime Minister of France that Saddam Hussein could be negotiated out of Kuwait with the United States giving him nothing except perhaps a little face saver. Since he realized, whether he was actually suckered into invading by Ambassador Gillespie's strange statement to him that the United States was not interested in Kuwait, or not, I don't know, the notion that that war was actually a last resort and that there was no alternative but to invade to get him out, and that the real reason for the war was to liberate Kuwait, when it later became clear that the real reason for the war, at least to me, that the real reason for the war was to destroy the Iraqi army as a player in Middle Eastern politics. That's followed by the Second Iraq War, which, as we know, is based on a tissue of lies and misrepresentations. So we come back again to the question, if we are lied to so many times, or if distortions are made, inaccurate information, whether it's deliberately delivered or not, and furthermore, if most wars, World War II perhaps being an exception, if most of our wars turn out with the war aims that had been declared not being achieved, especially when most wars end up with the United States gaining territory and certain interests in the United States being especially well taken care of, while others are not, what keeps us going back to the well? What prevents us from saying, in the phrase famously garbled by the president fool me once, shame on, etc. Right? We get fooled again and again. Well, it seems to me that the answer has got to lie in the field, difficult to analyze, of American culture on the one hand and also situational analysis on the other. That is to say, it seems to me that there are certain factors in American culture and certain social and socioeconomic and geopolitical situations that make us particularly vulnerable to appeals to go to war, for good reasons and for bad. And so I want to talk very briefly about a few of these themes which it seems to me relate to what I'm calling national religion. When I talk about national religion, I have in mind the concept that was developed by Robert Bellah and others in the 40s and 50s when they talked about civic religion. A concept developed, talked about for a while, and then which sort of went underground in some ways. And now it's time, I think, to bring it back again and to ask, what is the content of those beliefs and practices which we Americans practice as a nation, which have structural similarities to religious beliefs and practices, in part because I think they represent a fusion of nationalism and religion, but they're not formal religion. They're not religion on the books, they're religion in practice, if you want to put it that way. They're kind of de facto, it's a kind of de facto national religion. To be crude about it, it's the sort of thing that makes people from other countries come to American ball games and wonder. I just had this experience. I took somebody to a ball game at Nats Park in Washington, and when the seventh inning came around, and instead of singing "Take Me Out to the Ball Game," everybody sang "God Bless America," my guest said, "What is this? I thought this was a ball game." This kind of ferocious patriotism, ritualistically demonstrated, which we're all almost too familiar with even to notice at this point, is part of what I would call a national religion, but only a small and maybe not the most important part. What are some of the other parts? Well, it seems to me that looking at why we go to war, because war, after all, does involve issues that we'll die for, or have our friends and relatives die for, and which we will also bankrupt ourselves or pretty close to it for. It seems to me as a kind of, it gives us an entree into the subject of national religion. So let me mention a couple of themes that seem to me important. When I was doing the research on America's various wars, I extracted a few arguments which seemed to me to be particularly potent over time to Americans. And let me recite a few of them to you. America is under attack or in imminent danger of being attacked by an evil enemy. So-and-so is an evil aggressor whom we must either appease or defeat. There's no other choice. If we don't fight, the nation will be humiliated and dishonored. If we don't fight, the nation will become a second-rate power at the mercy of bullies and extremists. And all of those arguments involve, it seems to me, a kind of combination of the concept of self-defense and the concept of evil enemy. So then the question becomes, what do we mean by self-defense? What do we mean by evil enemy? All right, going on, if we have a moral duty to fight when our government asks us to make a patriotic sacrifice. We have a moral duty to rescue such and such a people from intolerable oppression. We have a moral duty to lead an armed crusade for freedom or democracy or peace or something around the globe. We have a moral right to make war because we are disinterested liberators, not selfish imperialists. War against such and such a nation is a last resort because one can't negotiate with such people, or because we tried to negotiate but they messed it up, or they refused to negotiate in good faith. And there's sort of an underlying premise to a lot of this, which is that solving such and such a problem requires military force. No alternative method of solving that problem is possible. All right. So, first of all, some quick notes. I forget when I started, but somebody will have to yell at me to stop when it's time to stop. Self-defense are often linked by us with the existence of evil enemies. That is, people who want our destruction, people who have it in for us, who want to do us harm. In fact, if one is faced with an evil enemy who wants to do you harm, the question of when the right to self-defense is triggered becomes almost moot. That is to say, you don't wait for the harm that you know is coming to arrive if you know it's coming. So there's an implicit justification for preemptive attacks if you have to begin with an evil enemy. But so what is an evil enemy? Well, in the first place, it's somebody other than us in a number of senses, somebody in particular who is not wedded to the values of democracy and human rights and free enterprise. But also, it takes more than that, because the world is filled with people who are not particularly interested in any of those three things. It takes somebody who has proven to be satanic in his or her, usually his, evil intentions and methods. Somebody, for example, who is intolerably cruel to his own people. Once the threshold has been reached, once the definition has been laid on an enemy as being evil, evil takes on a theological meaning, and not just any old theological meaning, because there are lots of theologies of evil, but an Augustinian to the max theological meaning. That is to say, the evil is interpreted as its own cause. St. Augustine said, in the chapter on the pears, especially on stealing the pears, St. Augustine said that evil essentially is a will to rebel against God. Other people have said evil is a will to, Milton, in the case of Milton, Satan, evil is a will to overthrow God, but also it's a will to destroy, it's a will to do evil. And as soon as the enemy becomes evil in this sense, the enemy goes out, it becomes outside history. There's no use talking about the historical causes of why Saddam Hussein did this, that, or the other thing, even if one of the causes is that we armed him to fight against the Iranians. There's no use talking about whether Osama bin Laden represents the grievances, among other things, including his own fanaticism, also represents the grievances of lots of people who don't want America telling them what to do in far-off places around the globe, and especially inhabited by Muslims. So once you decide Osama bin Laden is evil incarnate, then you immediately stop reading what he says. And when he says he wants American troops off of Saudi Arabian soil, or when he says he wants America to stop undermining Iraq, or when he says he wants America to stop its one-sided support for Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian, etc., you say that's meaningless. He doesn't really mean any of those things. The reason he hates us is the reason President Bush gave, because we're free. Because evil always hates good because it's good. That's the bottom line. And of course, once that line is crossed and the enemy is understood to be satanic in this sense, there's no negotiating with Satan. You know, either you yield to him, you appease him, or you destroy him. So that Hitler to take one example, becomes not a kind of historical exception, but the historical rule. Every enemy that we face becomes a Hitler. And the only choices we have are to appease or to destroy. Again, once that identification is made of the evil enemy. Now, what exactly the characteristics of enemies are that lead us to put them in this category, I don't know yet. Maybe you can help me with that. I know that even in the Mexican War, Polk, and in the Spanish-American, but even more in the Spanish-American War, the American drive to go to war with Spain was greatly helped by the fact that there was a general operating in Cuba under Spanish order, Spanish general called Weyler, who was called Butcher Weyler, because he was a vicious counterinsurgent of the kind that we become all too familiar with, because they are Americans who do that, as well as people in other nations who do that in counterinsurgency. He developed a strategic Hamlet concept. He developed a collective punishment concept. He butchered innocent people by the thousands, even maybe tens of thousands. In Cuba, he became the face of evil for Americas in Cuba, but it also fed into a mythology about Spain. Spain as the Black Empire, the tyrannical, superstitious, Catholic, cruel oppressors of the Latin people, all right, which immediately draws your attention to a contrast. We, the Americans, are the democratic, Protestant, libertarian, humanitarian people who are the kind of diametrical opposite of the satanic enemy, who are capable of liberating people in such a way that they stay liberated. So when the Americans go into Cuba to liberate the Cuban people from undoubted savage repression, two things are hidden. One is that the Cubans are negotiating for peace, the Spanish are negotiating for peace absolutely to the last minute, and had already made a proposal to Washington to recognize Cuban autonomy within the context of the Spanish Empire, in a way maybe kind of analogously to the way the British handled Canada later on. Autonomy within an imperial structure. And the Americans said, forget it, that's not negotiating in good faith. When some commentators have pointed out that that was an election year, and there was no way an American administration with the population so up to liberate Cuba was going to back off from the promises that it had made to liberate Cuba. The second thing, of course, that was hidden was that there were American groups that had interest in the ex-Spanish Empire, especially the Philippines. That even in the case of Cuba, nobody was really that interested in Cuban independence, and Cuba didn't get independence until 1958, 59. In any kind of real sense. And even then it was a kind of false independence, since we, for a variety of reasons, including US policy, we thrust them into the arms of the Soviets. But the Philippines was occupied by the United States at the end of the Spanish-American War, which is, by the way, a 4-month-long war. And a year and a half later, an insurrection led by Emilio Aguinaldo, a national hero, against the US broke out. The United States Army put the insurrection down, put the insurgency down. The latest estimates of the Filipinos killed in that war are 250,000. It was a typical vicious counterinsurgency campaign of the kind we've seen waged again and again and again. So the disturbing contrast is between the satanic enemy and virtuous us. The opposite of the enemy that wills only evil is us who will only good. And what somehow gets lost in all of this voluntarism is the effects of interests and the effects of history, the reality of history itself. I think it's correct to link this, although I'm still not sure exactly how to do it, to American religious traditions which are so highly voluntaristic that we tend to attribute moral responsibility to people for their decisions regardless of the circumstances which may be conditioning those decisions. We tend to think of moral decisions as being unconditioned. And one of the things that struck me very forcibly is a cousin of mine who was a wonderful historian, a guy named Philip Gura, at the University of North Carolina, has just written a spectacular book on the American transcendentalists. And one of the things he has to say about transcendentalism in that book is that it's all coming at you from a liberal perspective, not a conservative. It's not, conservatives talking about Satan. It's liberals talking about self-reliance. But Emerson is kind of the liberal version of the same sort of voluntaristic, extreme voluntaristic strain in our culture, which tempts us, at least, to pull historical events out of the historical context and to look at them as events taking place on the stage of some morality play, with people completely responsible morally for whatever decisions they reach, and therefore deserving of reward or punishment without regard to what the conditions of those decisions have been. They hate us because we're free. I have to say that in looking at the situations that exist which seem to call out these religious desires, essentially religious desires, to do good, to punish evil, and to rescue the oppressed, which I think is a fundamental premise of Judeo-Christianity, and nothing to sneer at. This desire to rescue oppressed people, certainly it was played to the hilt in the case of Iraq. One asks oneself, well, what is the social situation which makes these arguments particularly potent? That is, if one doesn't want to look at the arguments and the images, the evil enemy, the rescue of the oppressed, and so forth, just on an abstract level, but one wants to try to also link them to historical development, to social development in the U.S. and around the world, are there situations which make us particularly vulnerable to this kind of argumentation? I come back again to this kind of patriotic, let me say a quick word about American patriotism. Trying to investigate American patriotism in a way which is not an intellectual sneering at patriots. I don't think that gets us anywhere. Anyway, in some ways I feel patriotic. Especially because if this is a nation which is so susceptible to the moral appeal and so little susceptible to appeals to do war as a raison d'etat, we're really not realists at heart. That's not a bad thing necessarily. It maybe contains the seeds of even of a transformation of the way we look at politics. I'm going to be talking about that in my lecture tonight a little bit more. But so what's the quality of this patriotism? What's the content of this patriotism? One aspect of it was driven home for me very strongly at the Republican convention. Not just the USA, the kind of mindless USA chanting, but in McCain's speech in particular, which Michael Gerson reviewed. Michael Gerson, exactly reversing my feelings about the speech, said that the first part of the speech was just kind of the usual Republican claptrap, which one might also say about Obama's speech, was a lot of it being the usual Democratic panaceas and slogans and so forth. But where Gerson said that the speech became kind of transcendent for him was at the end, where McCain basically displayed his war wounds and talked about his experience in the prison camp in Vietnam, and said, and I quote, I have to thank my captors for this experience because it opened my eyes. And he said it opened his eyes to the fact that he was not just an individual, a selfish individual pursuing his selfish individual interests. There was something greater than him. He also opened his eyes to the fact, he said, that he wasn't tough. He wasn't as tough as he thought. He was basically powerless. And then he said, my country saved me. My country saved me. Meaning that the combined experience of being in prison, a prisoner of war, and having survived it, in part through identification with other Americans and the principles of the United States, saved him, not saved his life, saved his soul. He's talking about salvation, folks. And he's totally unconscious of the fact that when he says, my country saved me, he's putting the country in the place of God. But that's an aspect of where American patriotism often goes, it seems to me, with the best intention in the world and with a lot of, with validity, in the sense that we begin with a radically individualistic society, and people are trying to be saved from the consequences of unbridled individualism, with a cult of toughness, and people want to be saved from the consequences of trying to be the toughest, always the toughest guy on the block. We're going to eventually not be, or else you become a killer, a murderer. And they want to be saved from their isolation. And they want to see the possibilities of transformation, of self-transformation, of becoming a different kind of person and a less self-centered person and a more other-centered person. And the only problem with it is that instead of identifying with humanity and identifying the potential to transform oneself with the potential to become a child of God, or what secularists would call a human being, the identification takes place with the nation. So that the nation gives the opportunity to get out of this ferocious individualistic and toughness and all bag, but where it gets you is into a collective which is limited by the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Gulf of Mexico and the border of Canada. Or the Arctic Ocean, in the case of Alaska. So, in other words, the limits of the collectivity are the nation. And that's exactly the kind of idolatry that the prophets condemned when they preached on Isaiah and Jeremiah, the people who nobody in government who claims to be religious ever seems to have read. When they preach against the identification of the nation with God. They preach a broader human community. So, I mean, but of course, it seems to me you don't cure this kind of disease just by condemning it. You can, it might help to tell people to read their Bible, especially Isaiah, the two Isaiahs and Jeremiah. But you cure it, it seems to me, by dealing with the sources of the malaise at their, which are this out-of-control individualism, this cult of toughness, and and the rest of it. Anyway, I thought that the end of McCain's speech was truly creepy, only because of that, because it represented, he's a man of goodwill, I think, and I don't think he's conscious of the fact that he was preaching idolatry. So where do I go with this? One last point, and this isn't too coherent. I'm sorry. It really is a work in progress, so it's not all nicely tied up for you. What to do about any of this becomes a major problem, which I find that I didn't, in my outline for the book, did not deal with adequately. And what I would like to do is come out of this with a kind of set of guidelines or principles or, I don't know, stories, or all three, which will help our people and other people also think more clearly, I think more soberly, about appeals to fight, recognizing that these appeals have been made before, and sometimes they've been justified, and a lot of times they haven't. To give rein to their kind of native skepticism. Show me, I'm from Missouri, you know? Or as Lincoln said, show me the spot in the case of the Mexican War. And not to buy into this without a higher standard of proof than we're currently requiring. One key, I think, to changing the way we think about it is to go at the argument that the war is a last resort. Because in a way, this is a threshold argument. The moral appeals, etc., all assume that there's really no other way to deal with this leader who we're calling evil, no other way to rescue these people who need rescuing, no other way to defend the American interests that we say are being threatened than to go the military route. And there, it seems to me, the question of whether there's any way short of war to solve the problems of self-defense, evil enemies, etc., requires that people learn more about conflict resolution than they have learned so far, and the real potential of conflict resolution techniques to solve problems. Let me put it in two ways. Two requirements, it seems to me. One is that we ask ourselves, what's happening to us now that might make us vulnerable to this sort of appeal? Right? If you go out with somebody on a date, and somebody maybe wants to, gets overly friendly with you, a young man or a young woman might say, I'm drunk a little too much tonight to handle this in a kind of responsible way. So I'll read that. I bring that to consciousness, and maybe I'll say to my young partner, or old for that matter, let's talk about this tomorrow, because I've drunk too much tonight. Well, what's the equivalent in our national life of situations in which we've drunk too much tonight? One clearly is that we've been traumatized. That events have taken place which have left us shocked, fearful, vulnerable to appeals that say, here's some evil enemy that wants to do you in. I don't really believe that if 9/11 had not occurred, I don't think we would have gotten the second Iraq War that we got, at least not in the way that we got it. Right? But then maybe there are also structural conditions, not just kind of historical conjunctures, but structural conditions that put us in the same kind of vulnerable frame of mind. For example, it seems to me, and this is speculation, but what the hell, I'm going to say. There are times when our country is subject to such powerful diversifying trends, when we're becoming culturally, ethnically, socioeconomically, etc., much more diverse. And people start asking the question, who are we? Are we really one country, or are we a bunch of warring groups? What does it mean to be an American? That if the anxiety, identity anxiety, reaches a high enough level, there comes a point at which a leader who says, I'll help you define yourself by reference to them, to this other who are not you, and I'll show you the way you're different from and better than them. And it may mean that we have to fight them, but you'll find out in that fight who you are. So analysts before me have pointed out that World War I comes on the heels of the largest, most disturbing wave of immigrations that had ever hit the United States. when the country was seriously divided and disturbed over what it meant to be an American. And no coincidence that the Pledge of Allegiance is adopted then and there in the midst of that ferment. Well, we're in the midst of another wave of immigration. Another way of another question, who's a real American? Do you have to speak English? You know, all the rest. Are we more vulnerable now to appeals to find some foreign enemy against which to define ourselves? Yeah, I think so. I can't prove it, at least not yet, but it makes some sense to me. And lastly, I know through my own practice and my own theory and practice in conflict resolution, that most of the wars that we've fought, in which we've said there was no other alternative, there was an alternative, and it wasn't a shameful alternative, a disgraceful alternative. There's a fundamental confusion in people's thinking here and elsewhere between negotiation and conflict resolution. And the last word I want to leave with you is this. Negotiation for most people means negotiating from strength or from weakness. You arrive at some agreement across a table which reflects the balance of power that existed before you sit down at the table. So it might well be shameful to negotiate with, say, people who are doing terrorism against you. If what you mean by negotiations is, what are we going to give them to make them stop? You know, that is a definition of appeasement. But if conflict resolution means problem solving, if it means solving the problems that put both parties at each other's throats, usually some broken down system or some system which hasn't even been created yet to bring them together, that's a different enterprise entirely. It means healing and reconstructing relationships. It doesn't mean making concessions. It doesn't mean bargaining from strength. It means starting with an analysis that hasn't been done of what's driving the conflict. What's the context of the conflict? And when you do that, if we had done that with the Spanish over Cuba, actually McKinley even wanted to do it, but he was unable for political reasons to do it over Cuba. If it had been done in the case of World War I, I'm convinced. If it were done now in Iraq, if instead of saying when we leave Iraq, when the U.S. leaves Iraq, everybody's going to go at each other's throats, there's going to be a bloodbath from one end of the country to the other, if we said no, folks have real problems with each other in Iraq, there are also independent, impartial, skilled facilitators all over the world, not Americans, people trusted by the parties who could help them work out their differences, right? If you were just willing to get out of there and let them resolve their conflicts, they might have a chance to resolve their conflicts. As it is, every conflict in Iraq is doubled and tripled and quadrupled by the fact that we're there and that you're either for or against us. So without going on and on about this, it seems to me that one of the things needed is the kind of education in conflict resolution that will help people realize that although conflict resolution is not a panacea, it doesn't work in every case, it works in a lot of cases. And that rather than accept the word of government or of pro-war parties that there is no alternative, by which they usually mean there's no alternative but bargaining from strength, it's time to say, let's try the other alternatives that do exist and that have worked in cases like from Northern Ireland to Macedonia to a growing list of cases to Liberia, a growing list of cases in which the parties to very serious violent conflicts have found ways to reconstruct their relationship so that actually nobody loses permanently. Okay, I spoke too long, I'm sorry, and that's what I came to say, and I'd be very happy to hear what you have to say. Thank you. Sir.
A comment and a question. The comment has to do with Walter Lippmann's analysis that follows the same trajectory you're speaking of in terms of the need to identify the other and the enemy as absolutely evil. He attributed that to the need to mobilize public support for war in a democratic society as opposed to an authoritarian regime. So that's another take on the trajectory that you've described. The question I have has to do with whether or not you've considered the extent to which the sense that the public sacrifice is not being required in order to perpetuate the war is a feature of gaining public support for the war. I'm thinking of what's going on today with the case of Iraq, where we're told to go shopping when we're attacked. But I'm also thinking about what happened in Vietnam, when the draft began to affect more and more individuals in society, more families in society. The cost of the war became wider. That was followed by increasing opposition to the war. As many people have observed today, that if there were a draft at the present time, we would have a lot more protests and opposition to the war than we have now. Is that a factor that you've taken into account?
Yeah, I'm thinking about it, and I think you have you certainly have a point. Of course, the absence of a draft didn't prevent Americans from voting strongly against the war in the election of 2006, even though there was no draft. And in part because the costs of the war take other forms, especially financial, but also because I really, on the basis of the same argument I'm making, that there needs a moral justification that convinces people to go on supporting the war. If they feel it lacks moral justification, they won't support it. There's a kind of strange obverse to the point that you made, which is that from time to time, one of the arguments for war has been that we need a war to overcome our tendency to laziness and luxury. The argument was made very strongly in the case of the Civil War, and especially after the Civil War. I'm thinking of Louis Menand's book, whatever he called it.
Metaphysical Club.
Yeah, the Metaphysical Club, where everybody's talking about what a great thing the war was. Too bad it killed 600,000 Americans, but at least we got over our selfishness and our love of luxury and our indolence and our, and so on. And you do find that, I think, as a theme, kind of a recurring theme, that we need a war to recover in our discipline, our virtue, our manhood. And the volunteer, what is the volunteer army? I think the all-volunteer army, or what critics would call a mercenary army, does make a difference. But then again, they're talking about bringing the draft back. I mean, one of the issues I haven't discussed much this afternoon is the empire problem. And that is, if you're going to really have an empire, it's going to be involved in successive conflicts with the kind that we're seeing now, from 9/11 to Afghanistan to Iraq to Pakistan. Kind of sucked into it sort of becomes really a kind of state of permanent war. And I'm not sure you can do that on the basis of a volunteer army. I don't know. I think the Pentagon's worried, from what I hear, the Pentagon's worried about that too. The costs of maintaining that army then get so high that that then you cause pain to other elements of the population, even though they're not actually going on the line and fighting. But anyway, I think you have a point, and I need to think about it more. Sir.
You implied at one point that volunteerism is something that makes people particularly susceptible to being used. And you often talked about implicitly about ignorance and gave the impression I share the very sentiments. I'm not suggesting that it's wrong or that there's an easy answer. That dispelling ignorance would be an antidote to that voluntarism and would make people less susceptible to the truth. And to some extent that may be correct, but there's always the more daunting and perhaps dispiriting possibility that a person who says, oh yeah, there is a spot, the person would say, oh well, yes, there is a spot, but, in other words, there are smart people who accept all the things that you can show them, who are not ignorant. They just shift the burden of argument to an emotional level, and almost by definition, voluntarism, if it's fully embraced, is immune to reason. And you get sort of the feeling that's what's going on right now in the election campaigns, right? Democrats think, oh, if people only find out what Helen really did, then they'll say, oh my God, it was she. But there's the possibility they say, oh yeah, she did that, but. And what's followed by the but is, I just love her. She's just my kind of person. And so, I'm sure you're familiar with the reason faith or the reason will conflict.
Yeah.
And so it's perhaps a deeper struggle of the American soul.
So here's that's a very good point, and I'm not really sure how to answer it, except I was having a similar discussion with some students of mine the other day, and one of them said very kind of impatiently, said Americans just don't seem to be able to hold complex ideas, hold kind of an idea and its opposite in their minds at the same time. It has to be one thing or the other. So that if Saddam Hussein, let's just say, is a vicious, tyrannical, nationalist thug, which he was, but he was also a modernizer of Iraq and also willing to play ball with the United States from time to time, and also wasn't so much, would crush the Shia rebellions if they took political form, but otherwise would hand out money to the Shia mosques, etc. That kind of reality is too complex for people to hold in their minds. And then I think, well, yes and no. I mean, especially during an election year, everything tends to get flattened out. Which side are you on and all? But when you actually think about people, in their normal lives, and Sarah Palin's pregnant daughter is a good example. A lot of the same people say, oh, it's either you got to be a sinner and you're going, whatever, if you're pregnant. But now you hear people saying, well, this happens to teenagers, and she could be a good girl and still get into trouble. And it's not just one thing or the other. There's a more complex reality that they're admitting. So I'm asking myself, why can't we do that? Why can't we do that in the case of an alleged evil enemy? Even Hitler, who I think needed to be stopped by force, did also represent some legitimate aspirations of the German people. And if those aspirations had been dealt with in the 20s, instead of waiting for Hitler to turn up in the 30s and to exploit their, the lack of satisfaction of these basic needs for identity and dignity and autonomy and all the rest, then we might not have had a Hitler at all. So, a more complex analysis doesn't necessarily dictate peace. And we are capable of it, at least in our personal relations. But somehow when it comes to the public stage and the kind of the people wearing these masks, we become less capable of it. And of course, it doesn't help that we have an electoral system which makes it mandatory to not to offend anybody, or try to be everything to everybody, so that we don't, at a time when you think we would have the most intense discussion of issues like this, we have the least. So that's too bad. Yeah. I'm sorry, you had your hand up before, and then I'll come over here.
Thank you for your insightful presentation. I agree with what you say, and I agree with especially the focus on the moral argument. And I think that demonizing the enemy and dehumanizing the other and ideologizing the causes of war look like main features of American strategic culture. Could you please tell us more about these three elements?
Say it again. Dehumanizing the enemy.
Demonizing
Demonizing.
and like ideologizing the causes of war.
Well, I don't know what more I can say than what I already said about that. What do you have in mind? You have a question behind your question?
I think this is the three elements used by this administration to go to the war in Afghanistan or in Iraq. It's like main cause behind the moral argument to justify the war.
Well, I don't really have a good answer for you, but I'll tell you that when I gave a talk on this kind of book in the making to a group in my own institute, and one of the students who I really admire said, after I had done, said, why don't you talk about the times when we didn't go to war? Like, you seem to be implying that every time there's a possibility of going to war and some leader says the enemy is a demon, et cetera, that the Americans fall in line. But aren't there instances where we might have gone to war but didn't? Right? Where there was some resistance to this. So I've started to look, because that would help, maybe develop an analysis of the situation, the circumstances under which these appeals are most, are strongest. And I have found, I'm not deeply enough into it yet to be able to answer that question very well, but I have found some instances where people had said we need to go, the most obvious recent one is we need to go rescue the Darfurians. Which under certain circumstances might be part of an argument that led to a military expedition to the Sudan. And people saying, well, no, not, we're going to yell about it and carry, and protest and demand that the UN do something and so forth, but there's really no sentiment for US military involvement. Partly you might say, well, the government really doesn't want to get involved there, yes. But anyway, there were other situations in which there was a war. There have been kind of war fevers that calmed down before. One was the case of Venezuela in the 1890s that I've just been reading about. But anyway, so I'm going to try to do some of that research. I haven't really done it yet, but I'm going to try to do some of that research. That might help to answer the kind of question that you ask. Yeah. It's a good question. Yes. There was a gentleman who was first. No? Yes.
Yeah, your original question and attack premise of why the masses do it. I would suggest, because there's some real problem that some of your suggestions here are problematic, is going outside the discipline of American history. Number one, because national religions are not unique to American or U.S. history. And actually going to natural history and genetics, because my perception of reality may be watching too much Animal Planet. But if you watch natural history, animal behavior, it can explain 95 to 99% of our human behavior, whether going to war or other people's resources, or killing. War and killing, by the way, is diametrically opposed to just about every religious tenet there is. I mean, the fifth commandment, thou shalt not kill. Jesus on the cross saying, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they do. Revenge. This is all totally against religious tenets, so it can't really explain why the masses will get behind some plutocratic oligarch. But if you think of a fire ant nest, and you go kick the fire ant nest, the matriarch, the queen ant, doesn't sit there and go, boy, I need to justify it. Everybody goes. And they do it as a matter of, this is my animal behavior, this is my genetics, this is what this is within me. So what I suggest is that you look at the last 500,000 years of hominid evolution, and then look at our primates, other primates, gorillas, orangutans, and see how they behave in similar situations, and it will explain everything that you want to explain.
Well, thank you for the comment. I'm definitely in favor of primate conflict resolution. I mean, as a model, I think the gorilla orangutan model is exactly what we need. And it does raise the issue. I mean, the problem with using the animal behaviorist studies that I've found so far is that although there's some interesting material, and I may be missing out on some of the newer studies, the approaches of people like Robert Ardrey, the territoriality approach, or Konrad Lorenz, are, while interesting, sort of, in a way, bring you back to the starting point. That is to say, humans don't behave that much like other animals when it comes to matters of war and peace. If they did, we wouldn't have so much of a problem. Ardrey in particular, well, both of them, Lorenz in particular, points out in his study, his studies of birds and et cetera, and his book on aggression, he points out that if humans have these weapons that they use, if they were only limited to, their claws and teeth, fists and so forth, the picture would be different. Ardrey talks about territoriality. Territoriality is enshrined in the U.S. Constitution, which says that the president can make war without the approval of Congress as a response to invasion, if our territory is invaded. But now territoriality means that you did something nasty to an American base in Tajikistan or something. So that the territoriality loses all its meaning when your territory is universal. So the animal behaviorists I'm looking for, if you can maybe later refer me to something that you found interesting, I'll certainly look at it. As far as the religion point you made, I'm going to talk about this a little tonight, but an issue with religion is that every religion's got its war traditions and its peace traditions.
But they're basic tenets. They're basic tenets. Yahweh coming down to Moses, giving him the Ten Commandments. It doesn't say, thou shalt not kill.
No, but Yahweh says to...
Make exceptions when we want this person's resources, their oil and their opium or their tin or there are no exceptions.
Well, it's later people who have made the Ten Commandments the basic tenets. I mean, if you look at the Old Testament, Yahweh says to Joshua on the eve of the conquest of Canaan, destroy their altars and leave no one alive, including women or children. Jesus was crucified before his church had a chance to make any kind of similar transformation, but it made it. I mean, the Church of the Prince of Peace became a church of war at various times, various places.
But he was Jewish.
For reasons that, well, I mean, even the Buddhists have their war traditions. Look at Sri Lanka. So
that's why I'm saying religion does not
So you have a choice. People are choosing between these traditions, and so the question then becomes, why do they choose one way instead of the other way, right?
It's because it's animal behavior. We want something that someone else has, whether it's resources or it's about survival.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Thank you.